All right, I think we're ready. So welcome. It's Brent and David here talking about the Ag Forecast Network and uncertainties. The first thing we wanted to highlight this week is Brent's recent post on the value and importance of writing a good question. So Brent, what did you write about, and what have you been thinking about with that?
Well, I think it's really interesting. This trade war has created a lot of uncertainty, and we knew right away that we wanted to have something in there to help people think about um, whether the trade war got resolved. And one of the biggest steps in that escalation of the trade war, if we remember, was when the Chinese put retaliatory tariffs on U.S. soybeans. And so to us, that was a natural thing. Say, well, okay, things will get better when they get removed. And so we put that as a forecast question. When you think about it, one of the most important things is to always learn. And there's so much uncertainty around the trade war that I think we didn't even really know what the right question to write was, because it seemed obvious at the time. But then as uncertainty starts to get resolved, you go, oh, wait a second. Actually, the Chinese are importing some soybeans through state-owned trading companies that basically aren't subject to the tariff. Does that mean the tariffs have been removed? Well, no, not really. But, it just was one of those things that, oh, this is a question that seemed obvious at the time, but really we need to refine our thinking about the issue. And so the article I wrote was basically talking about that and talking about how we can learn from it, because sometimes we think we know the answer, or that we think we know the question and the answer that we're most interested in, and it may not be the right one, and so we get sidetracked a little bit. And I think this was a great example of that, of how to get better at thinking about uncertainty. And so we kind of stepped back from it a second and said, well, what do we really care about with the trade war? And if you're in American agriculture, what you really care about is that U.S. ag goods start flowing back to China. And so as a result, I think we wrote a slightly different question, which talks about the total value of U.S. ag and ag-related exports to China in 2020. So again, just trying to think really critically about uncertainty and learning from when we screw up. And I think that was not necessarily that we screwed up as much as we just, our understanding of the situation has improved now.
And that's probably one of the best outcomes over the last 18 months, is now we can have a little bit better defined outcome here in 2020, this $35 billion in potential U.S. ag exports of ag and ag-related products to China. I think, as we think about it and we apply it to our personal lives, sometimes the uncertainty is so big, we don't even know how to frame it. And I think recognizing that that's okay to write a bad question or start with a bad question, and be open to writing better questions as we know more about the situation. So in the Ag Forecast Network, and as you apply this thinking into your own lives, you might have one or two questions that try to look at the same topic. And that second question might come as you learn more about the potential situation.
Yeah, they always talk about how, you don't really learn until you do things, and you learn, you fail, or you learn, a better way to do it. And I think this was a great example of it. And I think even this new question that we wrote, it's really interesting, because there's just, Dave and I, we were talking about this before, there's tons of uncertainty about, well, okay, when we talk about $40 billion of ag exports to China, what does that mean? Okay, what's included in that? How are we going to measure that? Very interesting question too. I mean, if you just look at data, what the Chinese report for imports and what the U.S. report for exports, a lot of times there's a little wedge in there. So does it include Hong Kong? What's included in ag-related exports? There's just lots of really interesting issues in there that I think, deepen our understanding of the whole situation of trade with China.
Yeah, we all looking for more trade and more activity, but of course, we got to know what we're measuring. You got to think about that. Shifting gears a little bit, I think as the Senate starts to get back into session, one of the questions I'm going to be closely adjusting my forecast on is USMCA. Of course, the House of Representatives passed the resolution before Christmas. I think personally, the next 3 or 4 weeks in the Senate are going to be really important. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the Senate to get sidetracked with the impeachment, with the situation potentially that started this week in Iran, all the congressional hearings that could flare up from that. So I think if there's a momentum right now behind USMCA, I jump my probability. I think I'm around 85% of this getting passed before the middle of the year. I think it's July 1 is the resolution date. But I got to be honest, if I don't see a lot of excitement in the Senate in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I'm going to start pulling it back. I don't know, Brent, is there a particular question you're watching in the next few weeks?
Well, I mean, even just coming up today, this, the news that the United States basically, killed one of Iran's major military generals, and in Iraq, of all places, is all over the place. There's just a lot of uncertainty right now around international, politics and stability, I think. And so that's really on my mind, and how I think, the big thing for me is watching, see whether the phase 1 trade deal actually gets signed the 15th of January. I think that's a date that's out there, and it's going to be really interesting to see what that agreement ultimately says, because I think when you look at the news, the U.S. has been pretty adamant that it's going to happen, and pretty adamant about the numbers. I mean, Lighthizer been, it's a done deal, and quoting off numbers, and the Chinese, I think, have been a lot more circumspect in that regard. So that to me is a really, really big issue. So that's something I'm continuing to watch.
That's a great point. Sort of, sometimes there's little bumps in the road that really change the trajectory, and so the uncertainty around the world right now, especially this week, has a interesting trajectory that could really change how things play out. I think crude oil was up overnight, sort of shot up really quickly. I think you really underscored it. It's the U.S. Had an airstrike in Iraq that killed a high-level official from the Iranian government. And so that's just a weird bedfellows setup. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. I happened to see an article a few weeks ago where Iran, China, and Russia were holding joint military exercises, some cooperation there. And so I don't know what that, I'm not saying it has any implications for the trade resolution, but it's just a very interesting time in the world for all these countries to be working together.
I think, David, thinking back and just reflecting a little, we wrote on the AEI.ag website, kind of a decade in review, and we were chatting just a little bit about it. It's really interesting to look back at all of the things that have kind of transpired in agriculture, but even more broadly in the world. It's just has been a really kind of crazy decade. But when you think about it for ag, what in your mind is the big story there?
So I think the big story is, I guess I got two parts here. I'll tell you the big story, and I was thinking about the potential implications or the learning lessons here. The big story is, I think we spent the first 2 or 3, 4 years of the decade focused on how are we going to keep up with demand. A lot of talk about how we're going to feed 9 billion people in 2050. We had short crops, tight ending stocks, strong profitability. And then we sort of flipped a switch. And the last half or so of the decade was too big of crops, burdensome inventories, low commodity prices, low income for farmers. And it was just this tale of two cities. We start with the quote, "It was the best of times. It was the worst of times," from Charles Dickinson's book there. And it was really two different farm economies, different circumstances, and it shifted gears pretty quickly. That to me, the difference there was really interesting to wrap up in that decade review. And I guess the question I've been challenging myself for the last few weeks is, what was the big unknowns that, as we were thinking about 2010, I guess we all sort of knew the party was going to come to an end, right? Commodity prices would eventually adjust. Farmland values weren't going to go up for forever. The world was adding acreage, and so eventually we're going to catch up with supply. So I guess that wasn't the surprise. So what were we not anticipating back in 2010? I think it was the adverse demand shocks that appear to be stemming from this trade war. I think that's what really caught us off guard, that China wasn't going to be a valued partner. And this was, again, in 2010, we're talking about China's economic engine and higher incomes and growing population, and they wanted soybeans now to make pork, and they were going to want more pork in the future, and they're going to want beef in the future. And that was just this line that I think I personally and a lot of us took just for granted, that China would be buying forever. We've seen a temporary 18-month at least hiatus in this. I didn't see it coming. I think the lesson here is, what could we have been looking for to maybe saw this coming? We were discussing before we jumped on here, Brexit, and how Brexit really, the referendum took place in 2014 for the United Kingdom to leave the EU. That sort of seemed to put a wrinkle into this. I don't know. It's interesting to look back. What should we have been looking for in 2010 that led to this? It's always helpful to look at.
Yeah, it was really, the contrast between starting out with, really continual growth in Chinese demand, and it's still growing. I mean, as a preview, we'll have an article on that here next week. Really, really rapid growth. But the interesting thing is, all of a sudden, the Chinese export growth in some ways grew enough that it really got the attention of politicians in the United States, and it sold with the electorate. And as a result, we did something we haven't, contemplated for a long time, is, picking a fight with China on the trade side. And that, I think, was, in retrospect, you could kind of see it coming, but it was really hard kind of at the start of all of that to see that happen. And I think even as it was happening, a lot of us were skeptical, I being one, that we would actually go as far as we did. But part of that was, we were also, I think most people were skeptical that Donald Trump would be elected president. And so there's I think that is, kind of the big thing that was caught, I think, almost most people off guard.
And I think, the implications are, as we look at 2020 and we think about the next decade, you like to say, 10 years in the future, we kind of have an idea what might be in store. After 10 years and beyond, all bets are off. But the important thing to keep in mind is that even as we're sitting here January 3rd, 2020, when we do the decade review 10 years from now, there are going to be 2 or 3 things that just conventional, I guess, insights or conventional knowledge are just going to miss. And our goal individually, and I hope it's for yours as well, the listeners, how can we challenge ourselves to make sure that we're not caught completely flat-footed? How do we think about these things? I was thinking about, as you were sharing, you and I were discussing, will the trade war get resolved before or after the midterm elections back in 2018, kind of before soybean harvest or after soybean harvest, thinking about a 3 to 5 month trade war scenario. And then we got to the 5-month mark, and then we went to that 90-day truce back in December 2018. And we thought the trade war was going to be over by the time we planted soybeans in 2019. And so we've had this 3-month window sort of rolling, that the trade war is going to get resolved in 3 to 4 months. And you and I at least have debated, will it be 3 months or 5 months? And that window just keeps sliding into the future. But the point here is that there are going to be other issues that pop up, issues that it might be easy to initially overlook, but can have really big impacts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the one last thing we had on our list to chat about today is an article. I'll include a link in the show notes. An article that actually Brent shared with me a long, long time ago. It's from Jim Collins. It's the Stop Doing list. It's sort of a New Year's resolution is a time to sort of think, here's what I'm going to be doing. Here's what I'm going to add to the list of things I'm already doing to make myself better. And Jim Collins, a very classic piece. It's a pretty short read. Challenging read to look at and say, okay, what is it that I'm doing that just doesn't line up with what I want to do, and how am I going to step away from those things in 2020? One thing I started doing in 2019 is making a list of all the things that I was going to say no to. I didn't do a very good job. I sort of gave up midway through, but I've recommitted to that. And it's very interesting to look back and say, hey, I said no to these things, and they made a big impact because I could stay focused. And that's the point of Jim Collins's piece, is that by saying no to things, you're actually saying yes to the things you're already committed to. You're recommitting to those existing commitments, and that helps you stay focused and disciplined as you use your most valuable resource, which is your time.
Yeah, the first time I read that article was a long time ago, and it was a new idea to me at that time, and it's very powerful and very well written. Of course, Jim Collins is a great writer, so it's definitely worth thinking about, and something I'm constantly trying to do is figure out, what are we going to stop doing instead of adding to all the time. So it's great.
I just looked at the article was written in 2003, so it's definitely been around a long time. It's a great set of insights. We'll include the link in the show notes. So that's all we have on the list for today. We encourage you to go update your forecasts, dig in, and keep finding some new insights to keep challenging yourself every day. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.
Just one I've noticed that's moving quite a bit are some of the price forecasts. There's been quite a bit of movement in some of those, so take a look at those if you haven't updated your forecast for a while. It might be worth looking at.
All right, thanks a lot.